Have you ever been stuck between a rock and a hard place, where you have a tough decision in front of you and neither outcome is ideal? Sure you have. That's how a lot of you guys can explain your student loans, or any loan for that matter, car note, whatever. You'll gladly pay more in the future to get past the hardship of today. This is how a lot of us ended up with bills in our names. It was either put the bill in our name or let us sit in the dark for the next 3 weeks. And I'm not saying it's right. I actually argued the opposite. But a lot of people find themselves in situations like this throughout life. But what if the negative outcome isn't apparent? Hindsight is 2020. If you knew that you would lose your job 3 months after taking out that car loan and that you get that car repossessed, you would have never bought that car in the first place. If you knew that the degree you were going for wouldn't land you that high-paying job that you thought it would, you probably would have never gone to college in the first place. See, I love how we respond to history and act like all of the decisions that were made back then were just terrible decisions. Not saying that the effects of those decisions aren't realities that we have to live with today, just saying that there were real-life consequences if those decisions weren't made also. And see, that's the beauty of hindsight from a third-party perspective. You get to judge the consequence without being faced with the real-life alternative outcomes. We visit history a lot on this channel, myself and those who comment. We debate back and forth on several topics as it pertains to the past and how it affects our current society today. But what we rarely ever do is put ourselves in the subject's position to try and understand why they made the decision they made in that moment. Let's talk about some of the alternative outcomes we may have faced. Let's start with the civil rights movement. For the record, I am a defender of the civil rights movement. I think it was very necessary, although the man I idolized most was a staunch critic of the movement. Malcolm was able to see the effects it would have on us today, so he spoke against it. However, Malcolm was from the North, and I believe it was this geographical difference that created the difference in ideologies. I support the civil rights movement because it made life easier for Black people in places where there was a need for life to be made easier for. Down south, where strange fruit hung from trees, where that brown thing floating in the river wasn't a log. Their signs didn't say blacks for Kennedy, blacks for Trump. They said blacks for civil rights, blacks for school integration, blacks for voting rights. Civil rights were necessary. What we did when we obtained them, now that's a different story. Today we see the effects of that movement as being destructive to Black communities. As many of us have pointed out, that's when Black people assimilated to white culture, leaving behind everything Black. Black culture, Black communities, Black businesses, Black schools, etc. But the real question is, without that act, where will we be? Will we still be subject to white mobs pulling up to our homes, pulling our young men out because of their affinity for a particular woman? How long would it have been before those logs stopped floating in the river? Let's move on to the Economic Opportunity Act that created what we know as welfare, food stamps, Social Security, Head Start, Job Corps, where my parents actually met. They were all initiatives aimed at fighting poverty. The funny thing is, we only speak negatively on one of those programs. Many of us today look at the establishment of welfare as the moment in history where homes in our communities began becoming absent of fathers. You hear it all the time. Black women chose a check over a man. We also look at it as what created the dependency by some of our women on the government. Both negative impacts on the current state of our communities, but let's look at the alternative outcome. Did we want Black children growing up in homes without basic needs? I remember reading Dick Gregory, Nigger, and I remember how he spoke of his mother waiting tirelessly on Christmas for his father to show up. It would have been the first time he showed up in, 4 or 5 years or something like that. And he spoke of how when his father was there, all was good as far as the home being taken care of. But when he wasn't, his mother, and consequently the home, struggled mightily. She always had a tab at the grocer. They would sit around and wait, for food to be dropped off monthly by the relief truck. All the neighbors would come over and they would barter food. How she would get up early in the morning and go out and work all day for white people. How when she got evicted, she would have to ask the landlord for credit. How they would be on the curb or at the bus stop selling Kool-Aid. And this is all because their father wasn't home. And what's fascinating about this is that the time period would have been placed in the mid to late 40s, placing it 15 to 20 years before welfare was established. So taking into full consideration the amount of families, specifically children, that may have faced starvation, the amount of parents that out of human decency would have given their children to the state, or the amount of women who would have found themselves in their city's red light districts because their means were that restricted, would you choose the aforementioned effects that we are currently seeing today? Or would you let the children of the past suffer? See, we want to act like every woman had a man coming home and providing everything they needed. But the truth of the matter is, these are the tough decisions that some of them had to make in real time. Let's bring it back to today. See, today we complain about the cost of food, housing, fuel, etc. But we knew we would be here 4 years ago. But 4 years ago, we pushed for government assistance to get us through the pandemic because we needed the aid at that time. I don't know a single person who was eligible and didn't cash a stimulus check. I don't know a single person who was eligible and didn't file for unemployment. I know I was eligible for that PPP loan, but again, the 3 people I don't mess with is the I, the aura, and the S. But the point is, many of us chose the needs of that day over the consequences that we may have faced today. We can't look back 60 years and say what those people should have done when they were faced with their hardships just because it negatively affects us today. No, what were the consequences back then? This is why we have to show our people grace. This is the reason why. They didn't know how it would affect us back then, but we know now. And even if they did, what if that decision is the only decision that gets us to today? Well, we can't be the pot calling the kettle black. So we got a lot of things that we're doing today that is negatively affecting our children's future. And we can choose to correct those things, or we can choose to do what we're doing and hope they have grace for us. Subscribe to the channel, man.